There are moments when the smallest thing can reveal a feeling someone thought was gone forever. Your soulmate may have recently discovered that you still kept one meaningful memory from the connection you shared. And what makes this so significant is that they probably never expected you to still have it. They may have assumed that when the connection ended, you eventually removed everything that reminded you of them. They may have imagined that the memories disappeared one by one as you continued with your life. So when they unexpectedly realized that one particular reminder was still with you, something inside them may have gone completely quiet. It could have been an old photograph, a message, a small gift, a handwritten note, a place you once visited together, or even something so ordinary that nobody else would understand why it mattered. But they would understand. They would know exactly what it represented. And that is what may have made their reaction so much stronger than expected. Because suddenly they were forced to confront a possibility they had never allowed themselves to consider. Maybe you didn't erase the connection from your heart just because you stopped talking about it. Maybe you simply learned how to carry the memory differently. Imagine finding an old key in a drawer years after believing you had thrown it away. The key itself may have little value, but the moment you recognize which door it once opened, an entire chapter of your life can suddenly return. That is the kind of emotional reaction this discovery may have created in them. They may have stared at that memory longer than they intended, wondering why you kept this one thing when so many other parts of the past were left behind. And perhaps the question that affected them most wasn't, why do they still have it? But did that moment still mean something to them? That question can reach places people try very hard to keep hidden. Because your soulmate may have believed they were the only one who remembered certain details. They may have thought the connection became insignificant with time. They may have convinced themselves that you had completely moved on. Yet this one discovery suddenly challenged everything they believed about what happened between you. And they may not realize it yet, but this memory is about to make them remember something they had carefully pushed away for a very long time. And now the meaning behind that memory begins to become much clearer. Because your soulmate may have initially focused on the fact that you kept it, but the longer they thought about it, the more they realized that the memory itself was never really about the object. It was about everything that happened around it. It carried a moment they thought had disappeared with time, a feeling they believed belonged to the past, and perhaps a version of both of you that neither of you can completely return to now. That is why this discovery may have affected them so deeply. Anyone else could look at the memory and see something ordinary, but they know the story behind it. They know why it mattered. They know what was happening between you at that particular time, and suddenly that tiny reminder may have brought an entire chapter back into focus. They may remember where you were, what you were talking about, the way you looked at each other, something you said without realizing how meaningful it would become, or even the feeling of being understood by someone who seemed to see a side of them that very few people ever noticed. Sometimes one memory doesn't return alone. It brings other memories with it. One moment opens another, and suddenly the past doesn't feel as distant as it did a few minutes earlier. Your soulmate may have found themselves thinking about conversations they haven't remembered in years, moments they once considered insignificant, and little details that somehow became important only after the connection was gone. And perhaps what surprised them most was realizing that you remembered too. They may have assumed that time had erased those details for you. They may have believed that if you were truly moving forward, you would have thrown everything away and never looked back. But discovering that you kept one meaningful memory can challenge that assumption. It can make them wonder whether moving forward ever required forgetting in the first place. Maybe you simply learned how to hold the past without allowing it to control your present. Maybe you kept that one reminder because it represented something beautiful that once existed, not because you were secretly waiting for the same story to happen again. And that distinction can be incredibly emotional. Because your soulmate may have been carrying their own version of the past, perhaps one where they told themselves that the connection ended because the feelings disappeared. But now, this discovery creates a different possibility. What if the feelings didn't disappear? What if life simply moved both of you in different directions? What if the connection became something quieter instead of becoming meaningless? Those questions can be difficult because they force someone to reconsider a story they thought they had already accepted. Imagine opening an old book and finding a sentence you underlined years ago. At the time, you may have underlined it without knowing why. Years later, you read it again and suddenly understand exactly what it meant. The words didn't change, you did. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar with this memory. It may have always carried meaning, but they are only now emotionally ready to understand why. Perhaps they remember how much you cared about that moment. Perhaps they remember the way you reacted when it happened. Perhaps they remember thinking that the moment was small and ordinary, never imagining that it would survive inside someone's heart long after everything else changed. And now, knowing that you kept it, they may begin questioning whether they underestimated the depth of what you felt. They may wonder whether there were emotions you never expressed because you didn't know how, or because the timing wasn't right, or because saying too much might have made the situation even more complicated. They may think about all the things that were left unsaid between you and realize that sometimes silence doesn't mean there was nothing left to say. Sometimes it means there was too much, and that can make this discovery feel unexpectedly intimate. They may begin imagining what it would feel like to ask you about the memory directly. Would you tell them why you kept it? Would you laugh and say it was nothing? Would you admit that it still means something? Would you explain that you simply couldn't bring yourself to throw it away? Or would you remain quiet and let the memory speak for itself? They may never ask these questions out loud, but that doesn't mean they won't think about them. In fact, the questions may be exactly what keeps the discovery alive in their mind. Because now they have something they didn't have before, evidence that the past may still exist somewhere inside your present. Not necessarily as a desire to return, but as a meaningful piece of your history. And that can make them look back at the connection differently. They may remember moments when they didn't appreciate your attention because they assumed it would always be available. They may remember how naturally you cared, how easily you remembered small details, how you noticed things other people overlooked. Perhaps they now realize that the memory you kept was connected to something deeper about the way you loved. You didn't need grand gestures to find meaning. You noticed the small things. You remembered the moments. And maybe that is why they are emotional now. Because they may be realizing that something they once considered ordinary was actually precious to you. There is also a possibility that they are wondering whether they left a similar memory behind in their own life. Maybe they have something too. Maybe there is something they never threw away, something they never talk about, something that quietly survived all the years and changes between you. And discovering that you kept your own meaningful reminder may bring their own hidden memory back to the surface. Suddenly, they may be thinking about where they put it, whether it still exists, and why they never got rid of it. One memory can awaken another, and this is where the emotional connection becomes much deeper than the original discovery. They are no longer simply thinking about something you kept. They are remembering what the two of you once were. They may begin to understand that the connection had moments that were real enough to leave lasting impressions, even if the relationship itself didn't unfold the way either of you expected. That realization can bring both warmth and sadness. Warmth because something beautiful existed. Sadness because it no longer exists in exactly the same form. And perhaps they are finally understanding that some memories don't disappear simply because people stop being part of each other's daily lives. They become quieter. They move into different places inside us. They stop demanding attention, but they remain available whenever something brings them back. Your soulmate may have thought they had already closed that chapter. Yet this one discovery may have shown them that the chapter wasn't erased. It was simply closed. And now, for a moment, they have opened it again. They may be asking themselves why this matters so much. Why seeing that you kept one memory feels almost like receiving a message from the past, and why they suddenly care so deeply about something they believed no longer mattered. But the deeper they go into those questions, the more uncomfortable the next realization becomes. Because if you remembered that moment enough to keep it, then perhaps your silence after the connection ended didn't mean what they thought it meant. Perhaps they misunderstood what was happening inside you. Perhaps they assumed you had forgotten when you were actually learning how to let go, without pretending that nothing ever mattered. And once that possibility enters their mind, they may begin looking at every quiet moment between you differently. They may start wondering whether the person they thought had completely moved on was actually carrying a much more complicated emotional story beneath the surface. And that is where this simple memory becomes something much bigger, because it doesn't just remind them of what happened between you. It may force them to question everything they thought they understood about what happened after. Maybe the most unexpected part of all is not that your soulmate discovered you kept the memory, but that the discovery may have changed the way they interpret everything that happened after the connection ended. They may have spent a long time believing they understood your silence. Perhaps they assumed you stopped caring. Perhaps they thought you had emotionally detached and left the past behind without looking back. Maybe they convinced themselves that you had forgotten the little things that once mattered between you. But now, knowing that one meaningful memory remained in your possession, they may suddenly realize that silence and forgetting were never the same thing. You may not have talked about the connection, but that doesn't mean every feeling connected to it disappeared. Sometimes people become quiet because they are trying to understand what something meant to them, not because it meant nothing. Your soulmate may be beginning to understand that distinction now. They may remember the period when you became distant and wonder what was actually happening inside you at the time. Were you trying to protect yourself? Were you accepting that the connection could not continue in the same way? Were you simply learning how to move forward without destroying everything that once mattered? These questions can completely change the emotional meaning of your past silence. Imagine standing outside a house at night and seeing one small light still glowing through a window. You might assume the entire house is empty until that tiny light makes you wonder whether someone is still inside. The memory they discovered may feel like that small light. It doesn't prove that you're waiting for them, but it challenges the idea that the entire connection disappeared without leaving a trace. And that uncertainty can be much more powerful than a clear answer. They may begin revisiting moments when they thought you were indifferent and wondering whether they misread you. Maybe there were times you didn't respond the way they expected. Maybe there were moments when you pulled away instead of explaining yourself. Maybe they interpreted your lack of communication as proof that you no longer cared. But now they may be thinking, what if they were simply choosing not to say what they felt? That possibility can bring a completely different kind of emotion. It can create regret because they may remember how quickly they accepted the silence instead of asking what was behind it. They may remember moments when they could have reached out but didn't. They may wonder whether the distance between you became permanent because both of you were waiting for the other person to make the first move. And perhaps the hardest part is that there may be no perfect way to know anymore. Time has passed. Both of you have changed. The connection exists in memory now, and memories can never give you every answer. But that doesn't stop your soulmate from searching through those memories for clues. They may think about the one moment represented by the memory you kept and ask themselves why that particular moment survived. Was it because you were happiest then? Was it because you felt especially understood? Was it because something was said or experienced that you never completely forgot? Or perhaps because that moment represented the version of the connection before everything became complicated. They may not know the answer, but the questions themselves can bring old emotions back to life. And as they think about it, they may begin realizing something they hadn't considered before. Maybe you didn't keep the memory because you were unable to move on. Maybe you kept it because you had already made peace with it. There is a huge difference between being trapped in a memory and honoring one. Being trapped means constantly trying to recreate what no longer exists. Honoring it means being able to acknowledge that something mattered without demanding that it happen again. Your soulmate may now be seeing that distinction through you. You continued with your life. You changed. You experienced new things. You became someone different. And yet, you didn't need to erase every trace of your past to prove that you were moving forward. That can be a surprisingly mature realization for someone who once believed that moving on meant forgetting. Perhaps they thought that if you had truly moved forward, nothing connected to them would still exist in your world. But the truth may be more complicated. Sometimes people move forward by accepting what happened, rather than pretending it never mattered. Your soulmate may now be wondering whether that is what you did. And that question can make them emotional, because it suggests something they may not have wanted to believe. Perhaps the connection was meaningful to you, even after it ended. Perhaps they weren't as easily forgotten as they assumed. Perhaps somewhere inside your story, they still occupy a small but genuine place. That doesn't necessarily mean you want them back. It doesn't mean you are waiting for them. It simply means that what happened between you had enough meaning to leave an imprint. And realizing that can affect someone deeply, especially if they had been carrying the opposite belief. They may have thought they were the only one who remembered. They may have believed they were the only one who occasionally wondered what could have happened differently. Now they have evidence that you remembered too. That can create a strange emotional closeness, even when there is physical distance between you. Suddenly the past feels shared again. They may wonder whether you ever looked at the memory when you were having a difficult day. They may wonder whether it ever made you smile. They may wonder whether you kept it hidden because it was too personal to throw away. They may even imagine what you would say if they asked you about it today. Would you tell them everything? Would you say that it doesn't matter anymore? Would you admit that it still has a place in your heart? They may never know, and that uncertainty may be exactly what keeps the thought alive. Because unanswered questions have a way of staying with us longer than clear conclusions. And now, your soulmate may be carrying one of those questions. Did I mean more to them than I realized? That question can quietly change the way they remember the entire connection. They may begin seeing certain moments differently, recognizing emotional details they overlooked before. They may remember how carefully you listened, how you remembered small things about them, or how deeply you reacted to moments that seemed ordinary at the time. Maybe they now understand that you were never someone who needed grand gestures to feel something deeply. Maybe the smallest moments were the ones you treasured most. And that could explain why the memory they discovered survived. It wasn't necessarily the most valuable thing you owned. It was simply connected to a moment that meant something. That realization can make them look inward too. They may start wondering what memories they have kept without admitting it. What reminders have they never thrown away? What songs still make them think of you? What places still carry an echo of the connection? What little details have survived, even though they told themselves they had moved on? And suddenly, the discovery isn't just about you anymore. It becomes a mirror for them. Your one preserved memory may force them to confront their own unfinished emotions. They may realize that they also have parts of the past they haven't completely understood. And perhaps this is why their reaction becomes more emotional than they expected. They weren't prepared for one small reminder to reopen so many questions. They weren't prepared to feel tenderness where they expected indifference. They weren't prepared to wonder whether the connection mattered to you in ways they never fully understood. Most importantly, they weren't prepared to realize that your silence may have contained far more emotion than they ever saw. And once they allow themselves to feel that possibility, they may discover that what they thought was a finished chapter still has one final truth waiting to be understood. And this is where their reaction may become far more emotional than they ever expected, because by this point, they are no longer thinking about the memory as a simple reminder of something that happened between you. They are beginning to feel the emotions attached to it again. At first, they may have tried to remain logical. They may have told themselves that it was just an old memory, just something from another time, just a small piece of a connection that had already ended. But the longer they sat with it, the harder it became to keep those feelings at a distance. Something about knowing that you kept it may have touched a part of them they thought had become completely quiet. It may have reminded them of how natural things once felt between you, before misunderstandings, distance, timing, or circumstances changed everything. And suddenly, the past may not feel as distant as they thought it was. They may remember the smallest details first. The way you looked at them during a certain moment, the sound of your voice, something you laughed about together, a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time but now feels strangely important. A moment when neither of you realized that one day you would look back and wonder what might have happened if things had unfolded differently. That is the strange power of memory. It doesn't always return as a complete story. Sometimes it arrives as a feeling first, and then the details follow. Your soulmate may experience exactly that. They may not even understand why they suddenly feel emotional. They may simply notice that their mood has changed. Their thoughts become quieter. Their attention keeps returning to you. They may look at the memory again and feel something they haven't allowed themselves to feel for a long time. Perhaps there is warmth there, perhaps sadness, perhaps regret, perhaps even a sense of relief that the connection meant something to you too. Because one of the questions your soulmate may have carried quietly is whether they were ever truly important to you. They may have wondered whether you eventually forgot everything. They may have assumed that because you stopped talking, the emotional significance of the connection disappeared with the communication. But now they have discovered something that challenges that belief. You kept something meaningful. And even though that doesn't automatically tell them what you feel today, it tells them that the past wasn't meaningless to you. That realization can be surprisingly emotional because people often fear that something they treasured became insignificant to the other person. They may have wondered whether they were simply a chapter you closed without looking back. Now suddenly they know there is at least one page you chose not to throw away. And that can bring back feelings they thought they had already organized and put away. Imagine finding an old letter years later and recognizing the handwriting before you even read the words. For a moment, you're not living in the present anymore. You're standing inside the emotions of the person you were when that letter mattered. Your soulmate may have felt something similar. The memory didn't simply remind them of you. It reminded them of who they were when they were connected to you. They may remember how hopeful they once felt, how much they imagined could happen, and how certain they may have been that the connection would continue in some form. Then they remember where everything eventually led, and the contrast can create an ache that is difficult to explain. They may begin wondering whether some things could have been handled differently, whether they could have communicated better, whether they walked away too soon, whether they misunderstood something important. Whether fear, pride, timing, or circumstances influence decisions that cannot now be reversed. And this is where regret can quietly enter the picture. Not necessarily dramatic regret, but the kind that appears in small thoughts throughout the day. Maybe I should have said more. Maybe I should have listened. Maybe I didn't realize what I had. Maybe I assumed there would always be another opportunity. These thoughts don't always lead to action immediately. Sometimes they simply sit inside someone, changing the way they look at the past. Your soulmate may now be revisiting old memories with a different perspective because they know you kept one of them. And that knowledge can make them wonder what else you remember. What other moments stayed with you? What did you quietly carry forward? Did you ever think about them during the years apart? Did certain songs, places, or ordinary things ever bring them back to your mind? They may never have asked themselves these questions before because they assumed the answer didn't matter anymore. But now it matters, not because the past necessarily needs to return, but because the meaning of the past has suddenly become uncertain again. They may even feel a strange sense of vulnerability. If you kept something meaningful, then perhaps you cared more deeply than they realized. And if you cared deeply, then perhaps the connection had more emotional weight than they allowed themselves to acknowledge. That realization can be difficult because it removes the comfort of believing that everything ended cleanly. Sometimes people find peace by telling themselves a simple story. It mattered, then it ended, and eventually everyone moved on. But your preserved memory introduces another layer. It says that something can end without becoming meaningless. Something can disappear from daily life without disappearing completely from emotional memory. And your soulmate may be learning that now. They may realize that perhaps they don't actually want to erase the past either. Perhaps they have been carrying their own meaningful reminder without ever admitting what it represents. Maybe they still remember a particular place. Maybe they still have an old conversation saved. Maybe there is a song they avoid because it brings too much back. Maybe there is something they never threw away for reasons they never fully understood. Your discovery, or their discovery of yours, may cause them to look at those things differently. It may make them wonder whether they have been pretending to be more detached than they actually are. And this is where the emotional intensity reaches another level, because they may begin to understand that the two of you could have experienced the same ending while carrying completely different interpretations of it. You may have learned to accept it quietly. They may have convinced themselves that you had forgotten. You may have kept one memory because it represented something beautiful. They may have buried their own memories because they didn't know what to do with the emotions attached to them. And now, one small discovery has created a bridge between those two interpretations. They may suddenly feel closer to you without having spoken to you at all. Not because anything has physically changed, but because they finally understand something about your inner world that they couldn't see before. Perhaps the most emotional realization is that you didn't need to destroy the memory to move forward. You didn't need to pretend the connection was meaningless. You were able to take something valuable from the past and continue living your life. That can be deeply moving, because it shows a kind of emotional maturity that they may not have expected. You didn't preserve the memory because you were trapped. You preserved it because some moments deserve to be remembered even when the people involved eventually walk separate paths. And your soulmate may now be asking themselves whether they can do the same. Can they remember you without feeling consumed by the past? Can they acknowledge what mattered without needing to recreate it? Can they admit that they still feel something without assuming that feeling automatically means you should return to each other's lives? Those are difficult questions, but they are honest ones. And perhaps for the first time, your soulmate is allowing themselves to ask them. The emotional reaction may therefore have less to do with the memory itself and more to do with what the memory revealed. It revealed that time didn't erase everything. It revealed that the connection left an imprint. It revealed that you may have moved forward without becoming someone who denies the past. And it may have revealed something about them too. There are still feelings inside them that they haven't completely understood. They may put the memory away, close the conversation, continue with their day, and tell themselves they are fine. But later the thought may return. Then another memory may follow. Then another question. And eventually, they may have to admit that the reason this affected them so deeply wasn't because you kept an object. It was because, for one brief moment, they felt the emotional weight of what the two of you once shared. And now they may be standing at the edge of a realization they cannot easily avoid anymore. Perhaps they don't just miss the memory. Perhaps, somewhere underneath everything they told themselves, they still miss the person connected to it. And now, everything begins to come together, because the most important realization may not be that your soulmate discovered you kept one meaningful memory. It may be what that discovery ultimately revealed about you. They may have initially assumed that keeping something from the connection meant you were still holding on to the past, still waiting, or still emotionally attached to what once was. But as they think about it more deeply, they may begin to understand something completely different. You can remember someone without waiting for them. You can treasure a moment without needing to relive it. You can appreciate what a connection taught you without allowing that connection to determine where your life goes next. And perhaps that is the part they never expected. They may have thought moving forward meant forgetting everything, but now they are seeing that you were able to carry one meaningful piece of the past while continuing to build an entirely different future. That realization can be incredibly powerful because it changes the meaning of the memory itself. It wasn't a chain keeping you connected to them. It was simply a reminder of something that once mattered. And there is a huge difference between being trapped by a memory and honoring one. Being trapped means constantly looking backward, hoping the past will return exactly as it was. Honoring means being able to look back, feel something, accept what it meant, and still turn around and continue walking forward. Your soulmate may now be realizing that this is what you did. You didn't erase the connection because you were angry. You didn't destroy every reminder because you wanted to prove that you were over them. You simply allowed yourself to remember without allowing the memory to control your life. And that may be why their reaction became so emotional. Somewhere inside, they may have been afraid that what happened between you had eventually become meaningless to you. They may have wondered whether all those moments, conversations, emotions, and memories had disappeared completely. Now they know they didn't. At least one small piece survived. And perhaps that knowledge gives them a strange mixture of comfort and sadness. Comfort because they know they mattered. Sadness because knowing they mattered doesn't necessarily mean they still have a place in your present. That distinction may be the hardest thing for them to accept. They may begin asking themselves whether you kept that memory because you still have feelings for them, or whether you kept it simply because you respect the person you were when that moment happened. They may wonder whether the memory represents them, the connection, or an important part of your own personal journey. And the truth may be that it can represent all three without requiring you to return to the past. A meaningful memory doesn't always ask for a reunion. Sometimes it simply asks to be acknowledged. Imagine carrying an old photograph inside a suitcase while traveling toward a completely new destination. The photograph comes with you, but it doesn't decide where you go. It doesn't stop the journey. It doesn't tell you to turn around. It simply reminds you that there was once another place, another season, another version of your life that helped shape who you are now. Your soulmate may finally understand that your memory was never about refusing to move forward. It was about accepting that some moments become part of you. And if they are thinking about this now, they may also be confronting their own emotions with a new level of honesty. Perhaps they realize they still miss certain things about the connection. Maybe they miss the way you understood them. Maybe they miss the comfort of talking to you. Maybe they miss the version of themselves that existed when you were close. Or perhaps they simply miss knowing that someone once cared about them in a way that felt deeply personal. Whatever the feeling is, the discovery may have given it a name. They may not have expected to feel anything when they learned you kept the memory. They may have expected indifference. Instead, they felt something move inside them. And sometimes that reaction tells us more than any carefully chosen words ever could. They may have closed the memory, put it away, and tried to continue their day, but the thought may keep returning. Not because they are necessarily ready to act, but because something about the discovery challenged the emotional story they had been telling themselves. Maybe they believed you had forgotten. Maybe they believed they were the only one carrying the past. Maybe they believed the connection had been completely erased by time. Now they have to live with the possibility that it meant more to you than they realized. And perhaps that is why they may begin thinking about whether they should ever acknowledge it. Would they tell you that they discovered you kept it? Would they ask you why? Would they admit that seeing it affected them? Or would they remain silent because saying something would expose emotions they have spent a long time keeping under control? That uncertainty is important because the purpose of this story isn't to promise that they will suddenly return or make a dramatic confession. The deeper message is that something inside them has shifted. Their perception of you has changed. Their understanding of the connection has changed. And perhaps even their understanding of themselves has changed. They may now realize that people don't always leave our lives completely. Sometimes they leave our daily routines, but remain as meaningful chapters in the person we become. And that doesn't have to be tragic. It can simply be human. You can love what a moment meant without demanding that it happen again. You can appreciate what someone brought into your life without needing them to remain there forever. You can remember without returning. And perhaps this is the lesson your soulmate is slowly discovering through you. You didn't keep the memory because you couldn't let go. You kept it because letting go doesn't require pretending nothing mattered. You can release the future you once imagined with someone while still respecting the past you shared with them. You can close the door without burning the house down. You can walk away without destroying every photograph. You can grow without becoming bitter. And if your soulmate sees that now, they may finally understand something they couldn't understand when the connection was still alive. Your heart was never asking them to be perfect. It was asking them to recognize something meaningful while it was happening. Maybe they didn't recognize it then. Maybe they recognize it now. And sometimes realization arrives later than we wish it would. But late realization can still be powerful. They may look at that memory and wonder whether they should have held on to more moments, asked more questions, listened more carefully, or expressed more honestly what they felt. They may think about all the ordinary days that seemed insignificant at the time, but now feel precious because they can never be repeated in exactly the same way. And perhaps that is what makes your one preserved memory so emotionally significant. It became a doorway to everything they didn't fully appreciate while they had it. But there is something you should remember too. Their reaction doesn't determine the value of your memory. Their regret doesn't make your past more meaningful. Their curiosity doesn't define your healing. You kept that memory because it belonged to your story, and you are allowed to decide what that story means now. Maybe it reminds you of love. Maybe it reminds you of growth. Maybe it reminds you of a version of yourself that taught you something important. Maybe it simply reminds you that there was a time when two people crossed paths and created something neither of them completely understood. Whatever it means, you don't have to explain it to anyone. And if your soulmate is now wondering whether they still have a place in your life because you kept that memory, they may eventually realize that the answer cannot be found inside the memory itself. A photograph cannot predict the future. An old message cannot decide what happens next. A keepsake cannot tell two people whether they should return to each other. Only the people they have become can answer that. And both of you are different now. That is the final truth they may have to accept. They are not meeting the person you were then. You are not meeting the person they were then. If your paths ever cross again, it will not be about recreating an old chapter exactly as it was. It would be about discovering whether the people you became can create something new. And maybe that is why this discovery affected them so deeply. They thought they were finding evidence that you were still living in the past. Instead, they found evidence that you remembered the past while still moving beyond it. They thought the memory might prove you were waiting. Instead, it may have shown them that you were simply honoring something meaningful. They thought time had erased the connection. Instead, they discovered that some moments survive quietly, even when life changes completely. And perhaps when they finally put that memory away, they will understand why their reaction was so strong. They weren't just looking at something you kept. They were looking at proof that what happened between you mattered enough to leave a lasting imprint. But they were also looking at something else, proof that you were strong enough to carry that memory without letting it stop you from becoming someone new. Maybe they will reach out. Maybe they won't. Maybe they will continue wondering from a distance. Maybe one day they will finally tell you what that discovery made them feel. But you don't have to wait for any of those possibilities.